Worlds is just a simple way of doing logic games where you kind of, all you're doing is identifying the constraints of the game and then baking them into a solution. So the easiest example is if you have a rule that says X must go fourth, I would always build my first world on that. I mean, I'm going to write out my, let's say it's a game where you're putting things in order. It could just as easily be a thing where you're putting things in groups. Either way, if you're putting things in order and the rule says X goes fourth, well, then the world we're living in involves 7 spaces, if that's what we're doing, 7 spaces, and then you just write X into the 4th spot. And if you do that, you are making worlds. You're making one world because that's the world we're living in, the world where X goes fourth. If that was the rule, X always goes fourth, then of course, you're going to start with just put X into the 4th spot. And that is worlds to me. Even though it's only one world, it still is worlds because, well, that's the world we're living in. We had a rule that said X had to go fourth. I'm going to bake it into my solution. X goes fourth. That's the world we're living in. Now, we will frequently end up splitting our worlds because there's going to be, some of the rules aren't going to just tell you where players go, right? Some of the rules are going to be like, well, X has to go 4th or 6th. If there was a rule that said X has to go 4th or 6th, then I very likely might split into 2 worlds, a world where X is 4th and a world where X is 6th. Because now it's not just one world that we're living in, but it's, okay, there's the world where X is 4th and there's the world where X is 6th. And all I'm trying to do is bake the rule into my solution so that I don't have to continue to process the rule X must go 4th or X must go 6th. So it might be 1 world, it might be 2 worlds, it might be 3 worlds. Maybe there's a rule that says X has to go 2nd, 4th, or 6th. Well, I might choose that rule to make 3 templates. X goes 2nd, X goes 4th, X goes 6th. Although, when I contemplate splitting in more than 2 ways, or even if I contemplate just splitting 2 ways, I'm probably not going to do it unless that rule is connected to some other rule in such a way that it makes me think that I'm going to make a lot of progress by making that split. So what I wanted to start with today is just some common triggers for when I'm going to make those splits. I guess I should start. The number 1 trigger is, as I said, if they just tell you that someone has to go in a certain spot, or if they tell you that someone can't go in a certain spot, then I'm probably going to just bake that into my one world solution first. Because, hey, I can get rid of this rule by just putting X 4th, or I can get rid of this one rule by writing down X not 5th, if that was the rule that X can't go 5th. I will prefer a one world solution before I start making my splits. So yeah, if I've got an easy rule that I can just bake right in with one world, then I'll start there. Some other common triggers though, just things for you to look out for when you're thinking about, okay, how do I want to attack this game? Where should I start? I know that the team has told me that I can start anywhere. The team has told me that it's improvisational. The team has told me that I really am allowed to do this however I want to do it. Well, okay, how do you want to do it? Like, what's going to be the efficient way to bake these rules into your one or more worlds? In no particular order, I want to give you a few just kind of things to look out for when you're thinking about making worlds. So again, number 1, if they just tell you where somebody goes, please write that person into that spot. If they say, geography is always in the fall semester, well, then just write G underneath fall. don't write down that rule. Don't hold that rule for future contemplation. Instead, just bake that rule into your setup. All right. If it's not as simple as that, if they don't just tell you straight up where people go, common triggers include look for a player who is mentioned in multiple rules. It's kind of obvious. Once you've seen this, you realize, well, yeah, no shit. If somebody is mentioned in multiple rules, then that might be a good place to start. What we're doing here is we're looking for bottlenecks, and we're looking for an opportunity to bake our rules into our solutions. So if there was a rule that was like X has to go in an even spot, and then there's another rule that says X has to go before Y. Well, in that case, I might look at my setup and go, and like let's just pretend here that we only have 5 spots to play with, right? If I know that X has to go in an even spot, sorry, I meant to say 6 spots to play with. If I know that X has to go in an even spot, okay, so that's 2, 4, or 6. 3 worlds. Do I really want to split? Maybe. If there's another rule, though, that says X always goes before Y, well, let's think about it now. X has to go 2, 4, or 6, but X also has to go before Y, which means X can't go 6th if there's only 6 spots. Okay, so now I can see that X has to go 2nd or 4th. And so there I might go, okay, so because X is connected to, X is mentioned in multiple rules. One way of thinking about it is just X is bossy, right? X has these, like, X is particular. X is a pain in the ass. X has multiple restrictions. Okay, well, if I'm making my seating chart and one of my friends has a whole bunch of restrictions, well, then I'm going to probably have to start with them, right? Let's say you're planning a menu and one of your friends has 4 dietary restrictions. Well, you're probably going to start with them. You're not going to start planning your menu with the people who are like, oh, I'm an omnivore. I eat anything. I don't care. Whatever is good for me. Well, you're not going to be like, okay, cool. Let's make something fun for you. No, we're going to start with the one who's, gluten intolerant and also has a peanut allergy and also is a vegetarian, vegan, and also, like the ones who have lots of restrictions. Obviously, that's the person that you should focus on. I want to stress here that this is really just common sense. This is not like you had to take an LSAT class in order to learn this. Naturally, if you're just solving these puzzles intuitively, I hope that that's how you would want to solve the puzzle. It just doesn't make any sense to do it any other way. If you start solving a jigsaw puzzle, where do you start? Well, if you're like me, you're going to start on the corners and the edges. Why? Well, because they have restrictions. I mean, the corner, it can only go in 4 places. Of course, you're going to start with the corners. The edges have some more space, but we know that the edges have to all be connected to one another around the perimeter. Well, of course, we're going to start with those edge pieces if we're looking to solve this puzzle. All I'm encouraging you to do is to just naturally look for the bottlenecks in the game and start there. All right. So if somebody just has to go in a particular place, start there. If somebody else has a whole bunch of restrictions, think about starting with that person, the person who's mentioned in multiple rules. Another good trigger is a big block. So frequently it's either a sequencing game or a grouping game. On a grouping game, they might say geography and geology have to go in the same semester. There's probably not going to be 2 G's in the same game, huh? Let's say geography and philosophy have to go in the same semester. Well, if I've only got the fall and spring semesters to choose from, and if geography and philosophy have to go in the same semester, well, then it might make sense to just start with a world where geography, philosophy are in the fall and a world where geography, philosophy are in the spring. You have to be living in one of those two worlds. There's only two of those worlds. Why not just make them explicit so that you can then see how that impacts the other players in the game? So a big block in a grouping game or a grouping scenario, a big block in a sequencing scenario might be the exact same thing. I mean, if it was just like philosophy has to be immediately before geography, you go, okay, so there's going to be a PG at somewhere in my sequence. I switched now. We're doing a sequencing type of an activity now. If P has to be immediately before G, well, let me think about that, because I guess it could be first and second, second and third, third and fourth, fourth and fifth. If we only have 5 things to put in order here, do I want to make 4 worlds out of the box? Well, maybe it's not my preference to split it 4 ways. But if I split it 4 ways, I'm going to know exactly where P and exactly where G are in all 4 of those scenarios. And that can be really helpful because I can then start to see how it impacts other variables in the game. So a big block is another trigger. 3 triggers so far. If somebody just has to go in a certain place, start with that. Maybe if you see somebody who's really a bottleneck, somebody who's really bossy, somebody who's really particular, they're really restricted, they're mentioned in multiple rules. Hey, maybe I'm going to get to bake multiple rules into my setup by starting with that player because they're the one who's obviously a problem in the game. So maybe I start with them. If you have a big block, you can start with a big block. People who have to go together or people who have to go adjacent to each other, you might want to start with that. The final trigger that I wanted to talk about for sure is a conditional rule. So if you have a rule that says, it's frequently, by the way, the last rule in the game. I don't know why they do that. Sometimes there's going to be multiple conditionals in one game. The Friends in the Photograph game is a good example of that. The Birds in the Forest game is another good example. When you see a conditional rule, the hard way to do it is to write out the conditional rule, then write the contrapositive of the rule. Some of you do that and you continue confusing sufficient for necessary when you do that. Like it's not helping you to write out the rule and write out the contrapositive of the rule. We don't do it that way here at LSAT Demon, not anymore. Instead, so for an example of a conditional rule, by the way, would be if philosophy is in the spring, then geology has to be in the fall. Okay, if philosophy is in the spring, then geology has to be in the fall. If we only have 2 semesters to deal with here, you can eliminate that rule. You can make it so that you'll never fuck up sufficient for necessary if you simply build worlds around that rule. Got to understand what you're doing, though. You're making worlds based only on the sufficient condition in the rule. So the rule was if philosophy is in the fall, then geology has to be in the spring. So you're going to make a world where philosophy is in the fall, and you're going to make a world where philosophy is not in the fall, which if we only have 2 semesters, then, okay, philosophy can be in the fall, or if philosophy is not in the fall, then philosophy has to be in the spring. Fine. I'm allowed to do that because philosophy has to be in either the fall or the spring. Okay. Then I apply the rule, and the rule is very simple to apply. The rule said when philosophy is in the fall, geology has to be in the spring. Well, one of my 2 worlds has philosophy in the fall. In that world, geology has to be in the spring. In the world where philosophy is not in the fall, the rule disappears. The rule does not apply. You do not have to think about the contrapositive. The rule only applies when geology is in the fall. So I apply the rule when when philosophy is in the fall, I apply the rule. Geology has to be in the spring. And then in the other world where philosophy is not in the fall, I don't care about that rule anymore because the rule does not apply. frequently you can eliminate the nastiest rule in the game there, because there can be conditionals that are even worse than that. You know, there can be a conditional that's like, it can have multiple things, right? It can be like, if philosophy is third, then geology has to be fourth and statistics can't be seventh. Oh boy, that's impossible. Well, no, it's not, because philosophy is either third or not third. So you make a world where philosophy is third, you make another world where philosophy isn't third. You just put not P under the third spot. In the world where philosophy is third, you then apply the rule. I can't even remember what I said. Somebody has to go in a certain spot. Somebody else can't go in a certain spot. Fine, write that all in to the world where philosophy is third. That's the world where the rule was triggered. In the other world, philosophy isn't third. Okay, fine. Then the rule doesn't even exist. No contrapositive. Don't have to remember the rule. I get to totally forget it because I've already applied it in the world where it applies. And I know that it can't apply in this other world, so it's gone. All right, so I came up with 4. If somebody goes in a particular space, just write that in. OneWorld Solution. That's the world we're living in. If there's a hyper-connected player, somebody who's mentioned in multiple rules, especially if they're mentioned in 3 rules or 4 rules, I mean, like, look for the bottlenecks and consider making worlds based on that really connected, really bossy variable. If you have a big block of 2 people who have to go together or they have to go adjacent to one another, consider starting your worlds based on that big block. And if you have a conditional rule, especially if it's a really nasty conditional rule that you really just don't want to have to continue to process over and over and over, consider making a world where the sufficient condition is true and a world where the sufficient condition is false. When the sufficient condition is true, you apply the necessary condition. When the sufficient condition is false, the rule just doesn't even apply. Erica, when the rule has 2 necessary conditions, that's perfect, okay? So the sufficient condition is true. Well, then if it has 2 necessary conditions, then both of the necessary conditions have to be true. So an example of that would be, if P is third, then G's fourth and S is not 7th. That's 2 necessary conditions. Well, fine. So when P's third, G's fourth, S is not 7th. And then in my other world, I don't know shit about G and I don't know shit about S. I just know that P is not third, because I'm making a world where P is third and a world where P is not. The way that you guys always fuck that up, and when I look at your diagrams, you guys fuck it up because you try to make worlds based on both the sufficient condition and the necessary condition at the same time. And that just doesn't make any sense. Start with 1 player, the sufficient condition, the trigger on the rule. Who's the trigger? Okay, well, they're either there in the triggering spot or they're not there in the triggering spot. When they're there in the triggering spot, then the rule applies and you just get to write it right into your diagram. In the rule where they're not, sorry, in the world where they're not in the triggering spot, I don't care. As long as they're not there, then the rule doesn't do anything in that world. Ala, what am I missing?
I just really want to echo the part about conditional rules. I found that to be like the last sort of big click for me for games was making worlds with conditional rules, because for especially more challenging games, it gets conditional rules used to scare me on logic games, but they're not scary. They're just giving you that information in a this happens and then this happens order. That's all it is. And when I used to bake them in first, I used to like take a big deep breath and it would just feel like so much easier because now I don't have to think about the conditional rule. So I highly recommend that. And then the other thing is, I think this would fall under the bottlenecks category, but rule distribution, like the distribution of the actual individual elements. Let's say you have 7 slots, but then you have 3 things that can't be consecutive. Then that tends to have a limited, set of ways that can be distributed across 7 slots or even 6 slots. That game doesn't happen super often, but I feel like I found it happening often enough that just doing a quick like, oh, there's 4 things that can't be consecutive and there's 7 slots.
Yep.
Well, that's like fixed, even if, I don't know what order those might go in. Then I can just write that in. Sometimes that like little check can like absolutely destroy a game.
Yep.
But I think that falls under the bottleneck category.
Yes and no. I mean, there are games where it's like, well, we're not just putting the clowns in order. We know something about the color of their shoes. You know, this and so the what you're talking about is there might be a rule that's like, um, four of the clowns have red shoes and four of the clowns have green shoes. Sorry, four of the clowns have red shoes and three of the clowns have green shoes. There's only 7 clowns. And they might say no 2 clowns with red shoes can get out of the clown car consecutively. In that scenario, you would go, wait a second now, 7 clowns, 4 of them have green shoes, but none of them with red shoes can get out of the clown car consecutively. Oh, well, then they have to get out 1, 3, 5, and 7. That's a OneWorld solution, because all you're going to do there is you're going to put R for red shoes underneath the first spot, the third spot, the 5th spot, and the 7th spot. But yeah, you are baking in, you're baking in the rule about red shoes. In that instance, it's a OneWorld scenario, a one world solution. The world you're living in is red has to be 1st, 3rd, 5th, and 7th. And then you can get to work figuring out, well, you know, is it clown P or clown Q or clown R or clown S that's in the first spot? I don't know, but it's one of those 4 because those are the red shoe clowns.
Yep. Yep. And that does happen quite frequently. I found at least like once every couple of game sections, you'll see a game that is really easy to split up just based on the fact that a bunch of things can't touch each other, or there's repeats that can't go right next to each other. There's like a consecutive, non-consecutive thing used to crush a few games for me. And then I think it happened on my official test too. I just saw one. I was like, yes, it's one that I can split up based on the fact that they can't touch. And that was really killer.
Cool. Back to the conditional thing. I just want to say it one more time, that the necessary conditions do not matter if the sufficient condition is not true. Okay. And don't get all caught up on the necessary and sufficient and everything. It's just, the sufficient condition is the trigger on the rule. The necessary is the shit that has to happen when the first thing happens. Okay. So an example would be, if you get a DUI, then, okay, and let's go through the litany of bad shit that happens to you if you get a DUI, right? You're gonna lose your license. You're gonna have to hire a lawyer. You're gonna spend the night in jail. You're gonna end up spending $10,000. You're gonna have to go to a serious offender driver's ed program and whatever else bad shit. You're going to be embarrassed with your friends and family, you know, like lots of stuff's going to happen to you if you get a DUI. So in the world in which you get a DUI, you know that all that shit is inevitable. In the world in which you don't get a DUI, does that mean that you're not going to lose your license? Does that mean that you're not going to spend the night in jail? Does that mean that you're not going to have to hire a lawyer? Does it mean that you're not going to waste $10,000? Does it mean that you're not going to be embarrassed? Well, of course not, because there's all sorts of other stupid shit that you could do that could get you into those circumstances. Knowing that you didn't get a DUI, that's great. But it doesn't mean anything about all of those necessary conditions that are associated with the DUI. They could still happen. You could still end up, God forbid, having to hire an attorney. You could still end up, God forbid, in jail for whatever reason. You could end up embarrassing yourself with your friends and family. You could lose your driver's license in a lot of ways. Maybe you're just 90 years old and you know, instead of going around the roundabout, you drive right over the middle of the roundabout. That's an old a grandpa of a cousin of mine, I guess. They finally took away his license when he did that. He drove over the middle of the roundabout, scraped all of the equipment off the bottom of his car. His car then, like, the engine blew up 5 miles later because he didn't even realize he had done it. Okay, so they take away the guy's driver's license. Well, but that's not anything to do with the DUI. He still lost his driver's license for some other reason. All right, I think you guys get the point, yeah? I apologize on behalf of all other LSAT teachers, including myself in my first, 5 years of teaching LSAT, because I used to be real heavy-handed about sufficient and necessary, and you've got to write the rule, and you've got to write the contrapositive, and you have to always be aware of the contrapositive. Well, the only reason why I ever said that is because that's what I read in an LSAT book when I very first started my LSAT prep. You guys, if you've never read that shit, you don't thankfully, you don't need to bother with any of that stuff, because there's just the world where the sufficient condition is true, in which case we have to go ahead and apply all these necessary conditions. Or there's the world in which the sufficient condition is false, in which case the rule just poof disappears.